We're going to talk about hamstring strains tonight on this episode of River City Hardball. I'm your host, Andrew Gibson. Always a pleasure to welcome in from Optimized Physical Therapy and Sports Performance, Jacob Evanich joins us tonight. Jacob, how you doing, man? It's been a little bit.
Yeah, it has been. Everything's good, man. Life is busy, but I always love doing these and getting back to it. So I'm really excited about this one.
Yeah, so we've focused on a lot of different things over the course of the last several months of doing this podcast. One thing we have not talked about is hamstring strains, and I feel like it's a pretty common injury in sports, but in particular, it's a pretty common one in baseball.
Yeah, we were just talking before this, and it was like, man, it's one of those injuries that it happens to everybody. We see it all the time, and it was something we hadn't talked about yet, but actually, it's the most common injury for pro and minor league baseball players. So I figured it was a good one to do tonight, and it really does tie in with what we're trying to do here.
Tell us about the functionality of the hamstring. What is it? What does it do, first of all?
Yeah, so I mean, it has a lot of functions, but it one thing is it bends the knee. That's one of the main things, and it also helps extend or like pull back your hip. So that's another big function. All of our muscles, they do those motions, which we call like more a concentric movement when they move in those ways. But then they help when you're moving the opposite direction also. So that's called the eccentric movement of the muscle. So like a hamstring, it bends your knee, but it also helps control the movement of straightening your knee back out. And you think about it, if you had nothing to kind of slow down that movement, your bones would just be whipping around back and forth. So each muscle kind of plays both roles, where it does kind of has its primary movement, but then it also assists to kind of control other movements too.
So when you have a hamstring strain, there are certain grades for it. Is that correct?
Yeah, there are. So it's grade 1, 2, and 3 are what they are. Grade 1 is minor. Very minor. Grade 2 is, you have slight tearing in the muscle, but it is pretty significant. And then grade 3 is where it is severe. There's different numbers out there, but like 50% or more of the muscle is actually torn. So as we go up with those grades, you're thinking it's going to take a little bit more to rehab, or when you start getting to that grade 3, that's when you're starting to think about potentially a surgical repair.
So when people talk and reference about hamstring injuries, there's often, you hear the pop. What exactly is the pop?
Yeah, so I mean, you could feel that. So if it's hard to say what the pop is, you can definitely feel like the tightening of the muscle, and you can kind of feel back there. And a lot of times it does feel a little bit balled up, just because that muscle is kind of spasmed in that area. If we all kind of know a lot of the signs and symptoms of the hamstring strains that we've seen, where somebody kind of pulls up and they're holding their hamstring. Like you said, kind of feeling that little bit of a twinge in the back of their leg when they're running. If it is severe, you can have a little bit of like bruising in the area. The actual muscle can be tender in that spot. And then also if it is a little bit more severe, you have a little bit more like a straight leg walk that ends up that you see with people. And that's because they're just trying to move in a way that doesn't stress that muscle and tendon too much. So actually kind of bringing the knee up and forward, that really puts a little bit of stress on that hamstring. So those are some more of the kind of common signs and symptoms that you'll see.
What are maybe the reasons why you would have a hamstring strain? Would it be like, lack of exercise or muscle weakness or something like that? What would that be?
Dude, they're from what I've seen, everybody's always trying to figure out. This is another one. It's really common, but it's so multifactorial that there can be a lot of things kind of going on that can lead to it. So I think a big thing is, if you haven't trained in an ideal way for your sport. So say you are, really strong or something, and you focus on lifting weights during the off season, but then you go to your sport and say you are playing baseball or something where, it's good to be strong, but also you have to move in these quick bursts of movement. The way we train, correlates with how our bodies are ready to move when we're playing that sport. So if you haven't trained those certain movements, the muscle's not used to doing that. And then once it gets that increased force that it's not used to having to deal with, then that's when we can get a strain. You have to look at, kind of everything. How exactly are we moving? So that's a big one too. It's like what we call motor control. So are we moving in a way that kind of increases the stress on that muscle and some of the joints in the area? That can kind of play into that too. So there's a lot of different things that can play into it. Also just general weakness too can play into it. So there's just a lot of things. So if I ever see one, first you're trying to tell what you need to do initially to kind of get over it. But then in the long run, we need to figure out, okay, why is this really happening? And that just takes a pretty full body assessment to try to figure out.
And where you guys come in, your expertise is the rehab and those kinds of things. What do you do for a hamstring strain as far as trying to get back with rehab?
Yeah, so sometimes if it's a little bit of a lighter grade, like we're talking the grade 1, actually I try to see if it's a little bit of a nerve involvement with the muscle. So sometimes it can be a little bit off with how the nerve is transmitting to the muscle, for lack of a better way of saying it. And if we kind of work the nerve and we do things like nerve glides to get the nerve moving a little bit, and that also stretches the muscle doing that as well. And a lot of times we have really good results with that if it is a minor kind of tweak. Also, of course, we need to not stress that muscle in a way that's going to put it at risk again. So depending on the severity, we need to do some strengthening. But we also need to kind of give it time to heal up if it is more the muscle. So you can have like a tear more at where the muscle and tendon meet, or you can have it more in like the middle of the muscle. Typically the muscle will heal a little bit quicker. If it's a little bit more like high or low on the hamstring, you're thinking it might take a little bit longer to do so. And then a lot of it is you're going to go off the symptoms. So if they are still having a lot of pain or what have you, we'll do a little bit lighter things. You still want to move and everything, but you want to do it in a way that's going to give that muscle time to heal up. And then we could also do other modalities, stretching, things like that, or massage to try to help get that muscle to calm down and help the healing take place. And then once it starts healing up and you're not having as many symptoms, we need to just gradually increase how we're stressing that muscle. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. And then and there's a lot of opinions on it too that are out there. And then over time, as that muscle is getting pretty strong, with kind of our standard exercises and movements, then we need to get a little bit more sport specific with it before we end up going full tilt back into our sport. So one of the big things is we need to make sure we give the muscle enough time to start to heal up. A lot of times people want to rush back really quick, but we really need to make sure we get it right in the beginning, that we're given enough time for the body to heal itself. There's about in baseball, at least, there's about a 20% recurrence rate, even with the pros. And that's pretty high. 1 in 5 are going to have another hamstring issue arise. And then when you have that occur again, then you're likely to be out even longer. So it's just kind of a snowball effect. But yeah, as long as we get a little bit more sport specific before we come back, that's one of the biggest things. And we need to make sure towards the end of the rehab process, we're really hitting it hard and making sure we are training that muscle enough and not being too light on it. So we are really giving the demands of the sport to that muscle. So the body is fully ready to go back into play, because it's easy to really try to rush it in the beginning, and it's easy to not be doing enough at the end. So we just got to make sure that we really plan that out appropriately.
Talking about sport specific, a recent example we saw in a different sport, Christian McCaffrey for the Panthers, Carolina last week, pulled up with a hamstring strain. And it sounds as if that one's mild, sort of on the mild end. They expect him to be back in less than 3 weeks. Otherwise, they would have put him on injured reserve, which would mean he's out at least 3 weeks. So that's probably a week or two, possibly. Is that probably one on the milder side, you think?
That would be, but with those guys, as we've talked about before, they have the best in care, but also they're making millions of dollars to be out there on the field. So they're going to be pushing those guys to get back on as soon as they can. So when we're talking about somebody that's, high school and we have a lot of time, we're still developing, we need to make sure we get it right and not rush back. So I feel like that's a big reason why we do try to rush back. We see what these pros are doing. I mean, Adrian Peterson, what did he come back from his ACL in like 5 months or something? But it's a little bit more of kind of a risk reward thing where those guys are getting paid so much. They need to try to get back. And maybe he is just, it is a little bit more mild, so he can come back that quick, because that is true. It could be just a couple weeks, but everybody responds a little bit differently to these things. And especially when we're a little bit younger, I feel like we just need to make sure we get it right. So we really do go through all those processes to make sure we don't have that reoccurrence.
Well, I mean, you always think about on the more optimistic side of things, well, he'll come back in a week or two. Well, if you think about last year, and again, talking with the Christian McCaffrey example, he had an injury last year, a couple injuries where, okay, he'll be back next week. He'll be back next week. And then 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And all of a sudden he misses 13 games last year out of 16. So it's a process where you think you might be able to come back, but it may take longer.
Yeah, it could. And like you were saying, they don't want to necessarily put him on IR in case he can come back sooner. So you're right. It could just be kind of a week-to-week thing. And he's such a dynamic guy that if he can, they're going to bring him back. And, they want him back as soon as possible. So they're not going to say for sure, you're not coming back for those 3 games. So it kind of makes sense. With like with his instance and everything, just for when it usually happens, it often happens right before that foot's going to hit the ground when we're running. So we call it like the swing phase. So walking and running have 2 phases. It's the swing phase when your leg is in the air, and then the stance phase is when our foot is on the ground. So the hamstring has a lot of stress placed on it at that point where our leg's relatively a little bit more straight and about to hit the ground. So that's where a lot of those injuries happen. So in baseball especially, it occurs primarily, and this isn't a surprise really, they're most common to occur when we're running the bases, and especially when we're running to first base. That's the most common time to do it.
Yeah, it makes sense, especially when you think about in baseball, the sudden movements, and all of a sudden you're at a stop position when you're in the batter's box, and then all of a sudden you have to take off down the first base line. That sounds like it's the prime area for a hamstring strain.
Yeah, and in baseball, you're not constantly moving. It's kind of a sport where you're just walking around, kind of standing a little bit, and then boom, you have to be full speed. And that's definitely stressful on those hamstrings.
A couple more minutes here with Jacob Evanich from Optimized Physical Therapy and Sports Performance. OptimizedPTsport.com is where you can check them out, and also on Facebook and Instagram as well. If you're on IG, check them out there. 20% recurrence of injury, is that on the higher side of different sports? That's specific to baseball, but 1 in 5, like you said, 1 in 4 or somewhere around there is a pretty high number, I would think.
Yeah, honestly, I'm really not sure. That'd be interesting to kind of look up, but it just shows, man. I mean, everybody knows, they always say hamstrings are really tricky, and it's true. They just do so much in everything in our sports performance. So that's always a really big focus of any kind of rehab or strengthening programs, to really make sure we get the hamstrings and those glutes involved. Because we just need to make sure everything's somewhat balanced. The quads are so strong, and we always need to make sure. So people a lot of times become a little bit more like quad dominant with their movements. So it's always a big emphasis to try to make sure those hamstrings and glutes are really doing their part too.
Give that stat one more time. Is it that hamstring strains are the number 1 injury in baseball?
Yeah, that results in time loss. So it's 24 to 27 days on average is the time lost with the hamstring injuries. So pretty significant amount of time. You're talking about a full month of the season. You're talking about 24, 25 games,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we hear that all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. We hear that all the time. You're going on the IL with a hamstring, and you're at least down several weeks, possibly a month or 2. It's definitely something that we see often in the sport of baseball. tell people again about where they can find you guys, Powers Avenue and the facility there at DBAT. Tell them about it.
Yeah, so I partnered with DBAT Jacks over off of Powers University off of 95. I'm doing sports performance and physical therapy rehabilitation for anybody that's having a little bit of pain. Us talking about this, it just made me think. Constantly we see athletes who are coming in with a little bit of pain in their whatever it is, pain in their shoulder, pain in their hamstrings, pain in their calves. But a lot of it is we really need to shift the focus and make sure that we're spending a part of our year, if we're going to be playing all year long, like it's starting to be the trend, especially around here. Everybody's playing all pretty much year round. We need to make sure we put a time block where we're actually training and focusing on strengthening ourselves, getting that power and speed back up. Because if we're just constantly playing, our bodies have no time to recuperate and really get stronger. We can kind of maintain in season, but we're not necessarily going to be getting stronger, quicker, and giving our bodies time to heal if all we're doing is constantly playing. So I know everybody thinks more is better, especially if you want to get better at baseball, play more baseball. And it's to a certain extent. So there's a reason why the pros there's a reason why they have an off season and why during that off season they don't continue to play that whole time. But it just makes more sense to gradually continue to improve your bodies and yourself and your skills by having that certain time period where you can really get your body right and improve. And you think about football players, and I came across this week, and it just kind of it made so much sense and clicked. Football players, it's not even a question whether you're going to have an off season and you're going to train and lift and get your speed working. It's just everybody's like, yeah, that's what football does. It's the same across the board. Like everybody should be like that, and it would make a really big difference in gradually continuing to improve your speed and strength year after year, and then that will translate over to better and better sports performance on the back end. The stronger and faster you are, just basically as a baseline, the more room you have to improve in your athleticism. And I hope we can just start kind of getting that message out there on the importance of it, because it'll result in better health for the kids, better play, so they'll have more fun. And just making sure the performance is as good as can be.
It makes a ton of sense. You got to give yourself time to recover and repair and get ready for the next stage of your playing career for sure. And that's at every level. That's not just,
exactly.
high school, college, pro, at any level. That's the case. Jacob Evanich from Optimized Physical Therapy and Sports Performance. Again, check him out there at the facility at DBAT Jacks here in Jacksonville. Man, always appreciate a few minutes of your time. Always very informative and good stuff. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, thanks, Gibby. It was great. Appreciate you, man.